Good morning. My name is Kimberly Mueller. Anyone that ever paid attention in history class knows the story of the Titanic, the enormous, unsinkable ship that indeed did sink in April of 1912, killing most on board. We know this is an enormous tragedy that affected the entire world, but for the Clark family it was a blessing and one that they were very grateful for. Backing up to the time around 1910, Mr. and Mrs. Clark lived in Scotland with their 9 children. They worked very hard to afford their day-to-day lives, and traveling with a family of that size was minimal. Leaving the country was out of the question. But that didn't prevent them from dreaming. Mr. and Mrs. Clark had the dream of traveling to the United States and taking their 9 children with them. When they discovered the Titanic and that its plan was to travel to the United States, they set a goal. Mr. and Mrs. Clark would each work 2 jobs, save every penny that they could, and then purchase 11 tickets to board the Titanic and 11 passports to leave the country. At that time, one third-class ticket for the Titanic was about $40. In today's economy, that is about $250. Mr. and Mrs. Clark did just as they planned. They began working 2 jobs each, saved every penny that they could. 2 years later, just weeks before the Titanic was to depart, they had just enough money to do so. Mr. Clark purchased the passports and 11 third-class tickets to board the Titanic. They sat down their 9 children, smiles on their faces, and announced, "The Clark family's going to America." The children were ecstatic. They jumped up and down with joy, ran outside, and shouted to their family and friends. But then just 5 days before the trip was to depart, the youngest boy was outside playing when the neighbor's dog came and bit him in the leg. The boy began bleeding very badly, and afraid for his life, Mrs. Clark called for the local doctor. The doctor rushed over, sewed up the boy's leg, and carried him to bed. He was very weak from the blood loss, and afraid that that dog would have rabies. The doctor placed the entire Clark family under quarantine for 2 weeks. Mr. Clark was furious. He raced to his son's bedside, began shaking him very angrily, yelling at him because he was outside playing when he shouldn't have, yelling at him because he prevented the family from taking their trip. The boy, very weak, could only cry. Not getting the answer from him that he wanted, Mr. Clark then went outside. He looked up at the sky, began pumping his fist at God and cursing at him for hating his family so much. Not getting the answer from God that he wanted and ignoring the quarantine rules, Mr. Clark walked down to the docks. He sat there until the ship began to board. He watched as each passenger walked onto the ship, angry at each and every one of them because they were not the Clark family. He sat there still as the ship lifted anchor, and he sat there still as it disappeared into the skyline. Hours later, when he began his walk back home, he began to cry. He then sat down in his chair and ignored his family. Days later, when news reached back to Scotland of the Titanic's ill fate, Mr. Clark then understood. He went to his son's bedside and began thanking him and hugging him and apologizing for being so mean to him. He thanked him for loving his family so much and for saving them. He then went outside, got down on his hands and knees, looked up at the sky once again, and began praying to God and thanking him for saving the Clark family. The moral of the story is even under such a tragic circumstance as the sinking of the Titanic that killed so many, there was a blessing that occurred. A family that could not afford it ordinarily had worked so hard to be able to do so, but because of a dog bite, they were prevented from taking that trip. That tragic circumstance allowed that family to carry on full lives, get married, have children of their own. This story teaches me that there's a positive side to every single situation, no matter how horrible of a one it is. Thank you.